So I am really glad to be back at BC, and I appreciate the invitation to be able to talk about something that I'm working on and thinking about a lot. One thing I forgot to mention in the bio that I sent is I also taught for 25 years in the sea semester program out of Woods Hole and at sea, and in fact that's where I met Faye, who was a sea semester student, and where I've traveled several times to Tahiti and been interested in the works of John Lafarge. So the collection year is one of great interest to me. So, to speak a bit about museums, I am interested in trends, intellectual trends that we still see as currents in museums today that have their roots sometimes in the Renaissance and even going back to medieval periods. And one of the things that particularly interests me about medieval churches is that the collections in those places had a power that people could feel tangibly. If I gave you a piece of wood and I said to you, this is a piece of the true cross on which Christ was crucified, that is a very powerful thing. If I say, oops, wrong piece of wood, then the power of it is lost as quickly as it was gained. So one of the things about these relics in churches is that they are imbued with power by faith, by imagination, and sometimes we find that the object itself isn't what it purports to be. So, but in museums, we began to define, in cathedrals, we began to define what museums are. And so I'm going to start with a definition of a museum. And this is a definition that is flexible. So by no means is this the definition of a museum, but it works for us for today. What's the first thing about a museum? It's a repository. It has a collection of some sort. And it also has to have some organizing principle. So generally a museum is a gathering of things that have certain qualities in common. So they have an organizing principle. They are in a building, and sometimes the building itself strives to be a work of art. This was certainly the case in medieval cathedrals, but it's also a real trend today where there's actually something that people call the Bilbao effect, where after the success of the modern new museum in Bilbao, which brought an aging seaport into the current tourist community, that a lot of other cities have now had museums built that have buildings that will attract. This really began first with the Frank Lloyd Wright building of the Guggenheim Museum in New York City. But since Bilbao, it's really taken off as something that museums that are in buildings that sometimes are not very good repositories for the collections that they have grown up all around the world. The next thing is that they have to be accessible to an audience. This is the difference between a museum and a private collection, is that by museum we expect some access of some kind of public. We want something that inspires and informs us, a cultural center and a community center. This is certainly a definition of museums that became very popular as part of the discussion in the early 20th century. But again, this was sort of central to the place of the cathedral in the medieval world. It becomes a status symbol for the community. It's a trusted authority. In fact, in recent polls of who are the most trusted people in society, museums often come right up at the top. Congress, way down. That as you're looking at different entities that demand our trust. And finally, museums are very much considered a draw for tourists that underpins a local economy. And again, the Bilbao Museum in Bilbao, Spain is just the perfect example of that. They hired Frank Gehry to design a building for them that the building itself, no matter what was in it, would attract a tourist audience. And that's what museums are really thinking about today, is how are they going to support themselves by attracting a tourist audience. So let us just go back in time a little bit now and look at Venice, because starting in the early 9th century, the civic leaders and the church leaders in Venice decided that they were going to begin to attract an audience that would allow them to supersede local communities of Grotto and that was nearby, but also even begin to compete with Rome. And how are they going to do that? They were going to acquire a collection that would bring pilgrims. And they decided that they would collect relics, which is physical parts, usually bones, of all 12 apostles, the 4 gospelers, and that they were going to then build a building to house them. So, how do you go about getting a collection of relics? Sometimes you can buy them. In fact, I have a collection of relics here. Most of these have been purchased for me by my husband, including a piece of the True Cross. I've got a lot of great little bits of bone here. So you can buy them, you can get them as a gift, or if there's no other way to get them, you can steal them. And so that's what they decided to do in Venice. And in fact, there is a justification for this in the Catholic Church. It's called Furta Sacra, and it means that if a saint does not want his or her bones to leave the place that they're in, then they simply won't allow it. So that if you can steal the bones, then clearly the saint wants to be someplace else. So the first thing that they did was they sent off a group of guys to go to Alexandria. This was in 828, and to steal the corpse of Saint Mark, which was entombed there. This became a really popular subject for artists. Tintoretto, one of the great Venetian artists, did this painting of stealing the corpse of Saint Mark. So they sail across the Mediterranean to Alexandria. They actually bring with them the corpse of another saint, Saint Claudia, because they're going to have to replace one corpse with another, and because the corpses of saints have a wonderful perfumey scent to them and don't stink like other rotting corpses. They can't just replace it with any body. So they take the corpse, they put it in a wagon, and then to keep any of the local authorities from looking at it, they cover it with pork, because pork is something that the Muslim authorities will not fool around with. So they put it on a ship, and there are storms and there are great trials, but eventually they get to Venice, and they're carrying the corpse in a box or a basket. It's described in a couple of ways. And when they get ashore, they're headed to the Doge's palace, when all of a sudden the corpse just sinks to the street and will not move again. Again, Tintoretto had a sort of good time with this, even though we don't see this in a box. There's the corpse. At that spot, the Venetians built St. Mark's Cathedral. So they built a church dedicated to St. Mark, and then they began to collect all of the other stuff that they needed. Eventually, the church would burn down and be rebuilt. The relics were lost but reappeared. There was a lot of miraculous things that went on with this. And the church itself began then really to get a lot of great stuff. I'm just going to go back to this picture, this wonderful picture, because this is a church now that was begun to replace the earlier one in the 12th century, and through the 12th and 13th century, things were added to it, and it really benefited from the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when the crusading knights from England, from Germany, from France, all gathered in Venice, and it was what was called the Maritime Crusade. And they were going to head across to Egypt, but instead they went to Constantinople. And there they found that there were Christians there, but they were Orthodox Christians. And that was enough of a justification to say, well, we'll just stay here and steal all the stuff that we can find. And that's the point at which all this Byzantine art and also architectural features comes back to Venice. So they actually came back with columns and pulpits and works of art, so that, among other things, they stole from Constantinople 4 bronze horses, which had been on the hippodrome. And these were actually said at that time already, they were known to be by the Greek sculptor Lysippos from the 4th century. So these are not even religious items at all, but the Venetians stole them, brought them back, and they've been on the front face of St. Mark's Cathedral. Actually, they have recently been replaced with reproductions because the pollution was getting to them. But in the great Bellini image here, these are the 4 horses up on the top of St. Mark's that came from Constantinople. So they're not Christian figures, and it's one of the points I want to make is that among other things that the guys who built the great cathedrals were interested in is they were interested in secular art as well, and a lot of that went into museums. And so let's talk about of the great cathedrals. Here is St. Peter's in Rome, which was the home of the Pope. This is the building that was begun, worked on by Bernini, by Michelangelo. And Michelangelo in, what year was this? I'm going to give the right year for it. 1498 and 99 made this fabulous carving of the Pietà, which you can see today if you go there. It's a magnificent work of art made for St. Peter's. But also at St. Peter's at the same time, another statue came in, and this is Laocoon. This is a Roman statue of the 4th century BC, and it was dug up in a vineyard in Rome while Michelangelo was alive. And the Pope, Julius II, actually sent Michelangelo down to take a look at it, and then he brought it back to the Vatican, and it went into the Belvedere Garden at the Vatican. And in fact, the Vatican Museum uses this particular piece as the starting of the Vatican Museum. Again, it has nothing to do with Christianity. But the next Pope after Julius II was one of the Medicis, Giovanni de' Medici. And he was a big, he was part of a family that had collected art already for a few centuries and was very interested in it. One of the things he did was he had a local artist in Rome do a reproduction of this in marble that went to the Uffizi, which was his family museum. And so you can see that in Florence at the Uffizi. But here again, in St. Peter's, at the same time that Michelangelo is creating these great works of art, they're also collecting pre-Christian things that are found in the landscape. Giovanni de' Medici, he became Leo X, and he, Raphael was also alive and working for him on a lot of different projects. They were both very enthusiastic about things that were being dug up in Rome. This is a time when Rome is being developed, and there is a lot of ancient sculpture that is coming up out of the ground. And certainly Leo X was very interested in getting his hands on much of it, and it ended up going into the Vatican Museum. So we have works of art of a couple of different types that we can find in these old museums. But the thing that is really going to bring in the visitors are the religious relics. And these, again, are usually pieces of saints. It's kind of a grisly thing. Pieces of saints, pieces of the true cross. This is actually the Pope's sacred relic collection. And these two cross reliquaries are part of it. And relics are an interesting thing because they really became popular in the 4th century when Constantine was the Roman emperor. And Constantine came to Rome. He had been in Byzantium, which he renamed Constantinople after himself. His mother was Helena, Saint Helena, and she was one of the first people to go to the Holy Land and seek out relics there. In fact, she led a group of people that went up to Calvary and dug around seeing if they could find the cross. And they found 3 crosses buried in the ground and decided one of those must be the true cross. How can you tell which of 3 crosses is the true cross? You bring some sick people up there and you touch them with the wood and see if they're miraculously cured. And that's how they identified the wood of the true cross, which has since then spontaneously generated into enough wood to build a boardwalk from here all the way to the Holy Land. There are a lot of pieces of the true cross around. But Constantine also made it a rule that you couldn't sign a treaty without relics. You couldn't consecrate a church without relics. And that is still true. You cannot consecrate a Catholic church without having relics of a saint in the altar. And in fact, a few years ago, I was working with a student of mine from Harvard, and we were looking at relics that belonged to the Archdiocese of Boston. And that was when they had their library right on this campus, just a little across the way. And we were sitting there and they brought out boxes of relics for us. And most of them are things like these that I have here. But we found after a time that we were putting our feet on some blocks of marble that were under the table. And those turned out to be the stones that had the relics embedded in them, which had been in churches, which were sold deconsecrated. And so that's the first thing they do is they take the relics out. So you still cannot consecrate a church without relics. And there's actually a department at the Vatican, the relics department, that distributes those. So relics are a really important part of what people went to Rome to see, and they still are. This is actually from Vatican.com, the official website of the Vatican, and they talk about relics. They've been conserved for the benefit of both the locals and the many visitors who come to Rome every day. There are many relics in different locations within Rome. As a way of revenue collection, they're very upfront about this. As a way of revenue collection, Rome has made these relics to attract many viewers who pay a small fee. I read this several times and actually does say that. I think they mean they made these available. We hope that's what they say. But anyway, for a small fee, you can see them. And the following are some of the relics that you can see in Rome. And then they list some various churches. So at St. Giovanni in Laterano, this was the old Lateran Palace. So this was, in fact, where the popes lived before they moved to St. Peter's. But you can see several religious relics, among them the heads of St. Peter and Paul, the holy stairs from Pontius Pilate's palace, wood from the table used during the Last Supper, and the holy umbilical cord. That's a very interesting thing. Since Christ ascended into heaven and his body did not remain on earth, the only parts of him which could be relicized were the umbilical cord, the foreskin from his circumcision, and there are actually 4 cathedrals in Europe that claim to have that. Pieces of his beard and blood. Yeah, pretty interesting. You can see at Santa Croce, which actually means for the cross. It houses most of the relics from the Passion of Christ. Among them, thorns from the crown. There's lots of thorns from the crown of thorns. The inscribed sign that hung over Jesus during the crucifixion. Pieces of the true cross, and my favorite, the doubting finger of St. Thomas, the actual finger that he went and stuck into the wounds. And then at St. Maria Maggiore, you can see the Holy Crib, a piece of the true cross, the tombs of St. Matthew, St. Jerome, Pius V, and remains from the Holy Manger. Again, there are enough pieces of wood from the Holy Manger to build a ship, but it's interesting stuff. And so we continue to have these things available to us. All right, so what's on exhibit when you were to go into these great cathedrals in medieval and Renaissance times? There were bones, and this is in fact the thigh bone of St. Vincent Martyr. This is actually in Notre Dame Cathedral. But these bones, there's a lot of Italian churches, frankly, that you go in and the bones are, there's thigh bones that are braided together in an arch that goes around the whole front of the altar, and skulls lined up, each with a little crown of flowers on them. But most of the bones went into reliquaries, so the relic holders, and those were often great works of art. This is a fabulous thing. You can see the relic in it. A lot of them actually told you what was in it by the shape of the reliquary. So arm reliquaries are among the most famous. And here is, this one here, you can actually see the bone there. But a lot of them, they just have like little, this one, unfortunately, the bones are gone. It had pieces of crystal that would have covered this. This one here, which is called the Arms of the Apostles, is thought to have multiple bones in it. And that one was actually brought back from the Crusades by a guy, Henry the Lion. He was the Duke of Saxony, and he bought that in Constantinople from the guy who was the European king of Constantinople, and brought it back. Today it's in the Cleveland Art Museum. This one on the right is at the Metropolitan Museum. The one on the left is at a museum in Germany. This one is at the MFA. It's a smaller ivory one. You can see it's made beautifully from the shape of an elephant tusk. And then this one is St. Valentine's in Prague. So a lot of these that were on exhibit in churches that now we find them in museums. It's an interesting question about whether or not these still contain bones. And in fact, a few years ago, I was at the MFA and I went on a tour of the medieval collection with a woman who's working on a PhD in art history at BU. And I asked her, are the relics still in the reliquaries? And she said, no, they've all been removed and returned to their country of origin for reburial. And I was like, oh my God. Some of these bones, you can take a look at these, are like this big. That who are they going to send it to in, for a saint who died in the year 44, which is when John the Baptist died. So it was kind of a knee-jerk response at a time when we are concerned about having human remains in museums, especially since the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act was passed in 1990. But there's still a lot of human remains that are in museums. I mean, the Body Worlds exhibit, in its manifestations of, different touring elements, has been seen by more than 9 million people. The most seen exhibit of all time. Mummies, Egyptian mummies, are often in museums. So a lot of these, you can still see the relics right in them, so we know they're there. This is a foot relic of St. Margaret of Antioch that's at the Cloisters, the Metropolitan's medieval collection in Manhattan. This is St. Margaret of Antioch, and it shows, this is often how you identify what these are. Here she is, and she's fighting a dragon here, and actually the dragon ate her, and she had a crucifix which she used to cut her way out of the belly of the dragon and emerged. She's thus the patron saint of childbirth. Because she emerged from the belly of the dragon. Here's another foot. This is an unidentified saint. This is at a museum in Zurich. But again, the shape of the reliquary tells us what body part is inside. And here at Amiens Cathedral in France, what you see right there is the head of John the Baptist. This is head number 1. I just have to tell you that this is from a crusader, a French crusader named Valin de Sarton, and he got this in Constantinople on the Fourth Crusade. This is one of the many things that was stolen from Constantinople at that time. And it contained this head on a silver platter. And supposedly the platter said in Greek, "This is the head of John the Baptist." Of course, unfortunately, he had to sell the platter in order to pay for his way to get back home. So all he had was the skull with no inscription. So he gave it to his local church, and they instantly built a cathedral around it, Amiens Cathedral, and began to get relics to come. Began to get pilgrims to come to see it. And in fact, that cathedral is built with these wonderful carvings of the life of John the Baptist. And here is Salome receiving the head of John the Baptist so she can put it on a platter and send it off to France. Here's the head of John the Baptist in Rome. And this, like that other one, says, here is the head of John the Baptist, the precursor of Christ. Here's the head of John the Baptist in Hanover. Here's the head in Genoa. Here's his head in Munich. Here's the head in Damascus. And here is his arm, his right arm, and part of his skull in Istanbul. There begins to be a problem that you can see with some of these. Here is that hand in Istanbul with that piece of the skull. Here's another hand and another hand. All of these are hands of John the Baptist. And this is a finger of John the Baptist, which is at the Nelson Atkins Museum in St. Louis. But the head of John the Baptist was a very popular kind of relic to have. I know of 10 heads, 2 right hands, 2 left hands, an extra arm, a shoulder bone, which is at Saint Denis, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, a number of fingers, and lots of teeth. There are a number of tooth reliquaries, which are fabulous big silver or gold things that look like a big candlestick, and then it's got a rock crystal core that's carved out hollow, and there's a pick in it, and a tooth sits on top of it. So sometimes they're a fairly grisly sort of thing to look at. But in addition to all these parts of John the Baptist, Richard de Lionheart, when he went off to the Crusades, he came back from Jerusalem with the block of wood on which John the Baptist's head was taken off. Okay, this raises a really interesting question, and that is, I forgot this. This is a confusing one because it's a reliquary bust with the arm of St. John. This is in Prague. And, John the Baptist was a humble guy. He never was a crown-wearing person. But one of the things that happened in medieval times was that these reliquaries, people who came to view them wanted indulgences. And oftentimes this was forgiveness of sins, but sometimes it was to be cured of illnesses. So there were a lot of reasons why people came. The Catholic Church actually gave specific indulgences to certain pilgrimages, that if you made the pilgrimage to view this in Prague, then you could get a certain number of years off your time in purgatory. You could actually even get time off from a sentence in a civil court for undertaking a pilgrimage, which I think partly just gets you out of town, and the locality doesn't have to support you in prison. But people would take then jewels and other things and give them to the church to be placed in the reliquary. So all of these jewels that we see here are things that were given as gifts, including the crown, which might actually have come from King Václav, King Wenceslas. I'm not sure. But here, this is just to show you that this part of it, you can see the arm bone inside, and then here is a more recognizable form of John the Baptist holding a sheep, which was one of his iconic images. All right, I love this. In the 19th century, some skeptical people put together the skeleton of St. Blaise from various body parts which existed around Europe. And in fact, they even missed one because there is an right arm reliquary in Prague that they didn't have on this particular one. It raises the big question, and that is, are they real? So there are some relics that we look at in churches, and certainly they are real. I actually took pictures of 2 skeletons in Metz abbey in Austria a couple of years ago. And that is certainly a human corpse, skeletonized. And here's another one. They're covered with this sort of netting, but these are local guys who were canonized and were known in the locality, and their corpses were pretty much in the hands of the church from the start. So there was nothing that was at all sort of worrisome about how they got there. This is a relic that I saw several years ago in Bruges, and this one fascinates me. In fact, I have some old medals of pilgrimages to view this. This is the Holy Blood, and this is said to be a piece of cloth that has Christ's blood on it. So the story is that this was collected by a crusader in the 12th century from Jerusalem, and he got just this rag and then brought it back, and they built this fabulous reliquary for it, which is, again, rock crystal that's carved out. The caps are gold. It has jewels set into it. So for the last 1,000 years or so, this has been in Bruges, and that, to me, is impressive enough. But where was it for the 1,000 years before that? That's what becomes very suspicious. And in fact, I think that probably most of, if not all, of the relics that come from Christ's passion from the crucifixion are fakes. There's lots of nails around, of pieces of wood, the multiple spears. There are, and a couple of things of blood. So again, this has become impressive for having been in Bruges for 1,000 years. Heck, I paid €5 to kiss it. So that's a way that they make some money too. You can, for €1 you can touch it. For €5 you can kiss it. So there is a way that they're making money off this. And they have a order of knights that have been in Bruges for 1,000 years, which are still an active group, the Order of the Holy Blood, who absolutely believe that this was blood that Joseph of Arimathea washed off of Christ's body when he was putting him in the tomb, and then the towels that had the blood on it were saved for 1,000 years and then cut up and given to crusaders during the Crusades. So again, they sort of lost the chain of evidence for about 1,000 years, which is one of the problems with some of these. There are certain relics that we know, at least at the start, were absolutely real. It's unlikely that anybody, well, I'm not sure how people would think about this, but were those people who stood at the foot of the cross at the time of the crucifixion thinking, hey, this guy's really important, we better save this stuff, and then putting it aside? Not so sure. But with Becket, who was murdered in his own church in, what was the year? It was 11... Yes, thank you. So he's murdered in his own church. There are witnesses to it, 3 knights who are sent by Henry II when he says at a dinner in France, "Will no one rid me of this troublesome priest?" And 3 guys get up from the table and go across the English Channel and to Canterbury, and there Becket knows they're coming. He's at the altar, and they come and they stab him, and one of them severs the top of his skull with a sword. And people at this point know this guy is important, and he is going to be famous, and he's a archbishop who just was murdered in his cathedral. He's definitely going to be a saint and a martyr. So they did get out the towels, and they did sop up the blood and the brains and the piece of bone that had been cut off of the skull. All of those things they saved. And relics of Becket then begin to be distributed right away. These wonderful caskets that are about this big, made in Limoges, France, and there's a number of these. This particular one was sold in 1996 at Sotheby's in London. This appeared on the cover of the catalog, and I was just mesmerized when I saw this. It's the scene of, here's Becket, and here are the 3 knights with their swords, and here he's at the altar, so you can see the scene of the murder here, and then this is Becket being laid into the tomb. So Becket's relics were certainly real when they first began to be distributed, and there were a number of different kinds of reliquaries. This is another one. This one is at, that last one, by the way, was sold at Sotheby's, was purchased by the Victoria and Albert Museum, which is where it is now. This one, which you can just sort of see the image of the murder here with the swords, and this is at the Metropolitan Museum, and it's gold, and it's a pressed metal called niello, but it has this red stone in the top, which indicates that, in fact, what this had in it was a sample of Beckets' blood, likely on a towel that had been cut into a small piece. So these were very important things. So we know in 1170, when Becket was murdered, that the relics were real. A few hundred years later, there's a third arm on the scene. So even Becket, before too long, there clearly become fakes of this. But this is where we can talk about how these benefited local communities and also the local churches. So Beckets' cathedral at Canterbury now becomes a pilgrimage site. Becomes a pilgrimage site because he was murdered there, but also because his bones are laid out. So eventually, Becket was in a coffin. They opened it up. Much of the corpse had deteriorated. Actually, as soon as he died, they began to take some fingers and other things, though, which were passed around. But when the corpse was desiccated enough that it was just bones, they took the bones out and put them into a separate casket. And they actually had a shrine that they built, a big shrine. And here we can see what the shrine looked like from, this is actually a souvenir pin that you could buy in Becket's time. And it shows, here's the body of the saint. And then over the top of it was this big casket of gold and jewels. And this is where people would tuck in their offerings. And it was lowered over the casket every day. And there were actually, every night, and then opened in the day. And there were actually some holes in the casket through which you could stick your hands to touch the bones. So this was a pretty powerful kind of experience. So by the time of Becket's murder, there were already a lot of relics in Canterbury Cathedral. And when the pilgrimages start, it brings them enough money to build a new church, so that the church that we see now is very different than the one in which Becket was killed. The stones on which Becket was killed and that part of the church are still there. And in fact, it's a very powerful thing if you've never seen it. There is a modern sculpture of 3 swords above it, and then it just says Thomas is laid into the floor. And it's a very powerful thing to see. But already in Canterbury Cathedral were, here are some of the relics that they already had, among hundreds of holy items. They had the heads of St. Blasius, St. Firstus, St. Ostroberta, each in a head reliquary. They had the arms of 11 saints, bones, dust, hair, teeth of numerous others, the rock on which the cross stood, the table of the Last Supper, which you might remember is also at a church in Rome, the stone from which Christ ascended into heaven, which has footprints on it. And again, there's another one of those around too. And my favorite, a piece of the clay out of which Adam was formed by God. Okay, so these were things that you could see even before Becket was murdered. And if you traveled around England to other churches, you could see breast milk from the Virgin Mary at Walsingham. This actually turns out to be something that's very common, and it's not Mary's actual breast milk. It was, there was a cave that had these lime calcifications and dripped this sort of milky white liquid into and they called it the breast milk of Mary. I'm not sure if people who had that knew that that's what it was. Glasgow preserved, okay, these are 2 very mysterious things to me, but in the cathedral at Glasgow, they had the mouth of St. Ninian. Yeah, I'm not sure. And also St. Martin's sweat. At Wimborne Abbey, you could see some of Jesus's beard hairs and the hair shirt of St. Francis, and then pieces of the manger, again, which is in Rome, but you could also see that in England at Glasgow, Warwick, Canterbury. Warwick also had Abraham's chair and the burning bush of Moses. So there were a lot of things that, again, many of these popped up, clearly fakes, during the time of the Crusades, and people brought them back, and the justification for their reality was really that they had come from Jerusalem. But there were a lot of people in Jerusalem that knew how to fake stuff up. And in fact, the picture I have up here on the left is of a pilgrimage to Canterbury in the late 14th century. Geoffrey Chaucer, this is a version, in fact, of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Geoffrey Chaucer made a pilgrimage there in 1387, and so when he set Canterbury Tales, it's on a pilgrimage to Canterbury, and each of the characters are going to tell a story on the way there and a story on the way back. And this is the wife of Bath here. This is from a really important early manuscript of the Canterbury Tales. But even at that time, at the time that those guys were going to Canterbury, more than 200,000 people made a pilgrimage there in that year, 1387. So it was a huge, big deal. And they were making a lot of money on it by the sale of these kinds of pins. So these are souvenir pins. This one of the tomb of Becket, as I said. This is one of the head of Becket. And actually, that's been reproduced. I have one that I bought there a couple of years ago. Actually, it was 20 years ago. I retraced the wife of Bath's pilgrimage and walked from Bath to Canterbury for a month across England. And when I got to the church, it was a sort of overwhelming thing to have finished there after being on foot for 30 days. I bought one of these, but this is an actual one at the Museum of London. And a lot of these, the Museum of London has the most extensive collection of pilgrimage badges, and most of them have actually been dredged up from the Thames, because at the time of the Reformation in England, a lot of people who didn't want to have these Catholic iconographic things around went and threw them off of London Bridge and into the Thames. So they found thousands of them there, and this is one that's been reproduced. So they had a gift shop. I mean, they clearly had sort of all of the things that we think of in terms of modern museums. All right, so Becket's relics, we know, were real right after the... Oh, I have one other slide here, which is, this is, you can still buy. This is a reproduction of that that you can buy if you go to Canterbury Cathedral. They sell in their gift shop these various reproductions. All right, so that one we know is real. There are some very powerful sites where I think we have to just... be extremely skeptical about the relics that are held there. This is from Santiago de Compostela on the coast of Spain, the northwest coast of Spain. And there, St. James the Elder, the apostle, who was beheaded under the orders of King Herod in the year 44, in the 9th century, miraculously, a boat appears with his corpse in it that has been, according to this image, navigated by angels. So there's still a church in Jerusalem that says that they have the head of St. James under their altar. But just saying that they had this apostle's bones, which you have to admit is really kind of outrageous, that a guy who had been beheaded 800 years earlier suddenly shows up in a boat on the coast of Spain. This is a very popular subject of artists. This is actually a really interesting portrait by Rembrandt, and it shows the iconic things of St. James that we associate with him because of the pilgrimage that started to visit that site in Spain. You can just barely see here that there's a scallop shell pin that's holding on his cape, and also this is the classic pilgrim's hat with a scallop shell on the upturned brim of it, and then the staff of the pilgrim. And this is at a church in Barcelona, where I went with an SEA class a couple of years ago. And it's just a gorgeous rendition. But this is supposed to be the corpse of St. James washed up on the beach. And you can see he's covered with scallop shells. Again, this corpse is in excellent condition for having no head and being 800 years old. But when you get to the cathedral at Santiago de Compostela, and this is still a big pilgrimage. Last year, more than 20,000 people did the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela from Spain, from France, from Portugal. It's a very interesting thing to do. And when you get into the church, this is the altar, and this is a bust of St. James, and his relics are said to be inside this bust. And you can actually go around back here and up a little flight of stairs and stick your arms out through there and embrace it. You can put your arms right around it. It's a really interesting place. And the other thing they have is every day at noon when the pilgrims arrive, and if you've traveled more than 100 kilometers, you can actually sign up and get the official certificate of having done the pilgrimage. But they have this thing called the buo fumaria, which is a big incense burner. It's like 5 feet tall. And when I first came into the church, I saw all this rigging that was coming down. It looked like the rigging of a ship, and these ropes that are cleated to the pillar there. And they come out in the middle of the Mass, and they lower this thing down, and they light it up. And then one guy grabs onto it and starts it swinging, and a group of guys holding these ropes run back and forth across the church, and this thing swings, billowing smoke at 60 miles an hour across the transept of the church. It is a very impressive thing to see. It's worth doing the pilgrimage for that alone. Again, this is an interesting business. There is signage all along the various paths. Again, here's a classic St. James wearing the scallop as a pilgrim. He's wearing the scallop shell on his hat. He's got the scallop shells on his lapels. The staff with a gourd for water that's tied to it is one of the classic things too. And so the scallop shell has become the symbol of the Santiago de Compostela pilgrimage. Here's one actually that I bought at the church. So you can buy still exactly the same kinds of souvenirs that they were selling in the past, but you can also get them in lots of different materials. I have actually some ivory scallop shells that I bought there as well. So, again, this is a business for the church. It's an important business, but you go there to see these great relics. And along the way, they actually, there are places on the path, either from any of the destinations, that also built up a reputation for having interesting relics, and people will stop there as part of the experience. So this is at a place called Conques in France, and there they have this wonderful little medieval church. And here is, in fact, above the gates. This is the entrance to heaven on the left. So it's like, welcome to heaven, come through this door, and the entrance to hell on the right. Welcome to hell, get in this beast's mouth. It's a very interesting thing, but they have an extraordinary reliquary there, which is said to be the relics of Saint Foy, who was a local woman who died in the 4th century, and she was canonized. They kept her relics in one church, and then in the 9th century, which was really the great time for stealing relics, the people from Conques went to this other church, stole the relics, and brought them back. And then in the 10th century, they divided up the body into different reliquaries. So this is said to hold her head. It stands about this tall. And it's made out of wood that's covered with sheets of gold. But they did a restoration of this a few years ago, and they found that inside the head, which is just about, life-size, it is life-size, there's either a Roman helmet or a Roman mask around which they built the face. It's a really extraordinary thing. This was paraded around town and brought in, but there have been, ever since Compostela has become a popular destination of pilgrimage, places like this along the way have been really important. Also, another important place is Oviedo in Spain, and I have been interested in this for a number of years because maritime historian, I read a lot of shipboard logs and journals, and I saw this about 25 years ago in a journal at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, and it was a colonial voyage, 1727, so it's pretty early for an American documented voyage, by this guy Joshua Benjamin of Charlestown, Massachusetts. And on the coast of Spain, he had gone to see the cathedral at Oviedo and wrote in his journal the relics that he had seen, which were one of St. Stephen the Martyr's hands kept in a box with glass over it, a piece of the Apostle St. Bartholomew's skin, 8 of the thorns which were of our Savior's crown, some of the bread of the Last Supper and of the manna with which God fed the children of Israel in the wilderness, in a small gilt box some of the Blessed Virgin's milk with some of her hair, and one of the 30 pieces of silver for which Judas sold our Lord. That was a great collection of stuff. And Oviedo was a major stop for that. One thing he didn't mention, which I saw there a few years ago, is this is supposed to be one of the jugs from the wedding feast at Cana, where the water was turned into wine. And they actually have a great little room of relics. And this is what it looked like 50 years ago. And this is what it looks like when I was there 2 years ago. And one of the things I want to point out is they have really adopted modern museum technology in terms of exhibition and care of things. And so it's not quite as interesting, I think, unfortunately, as it was when they had these old relic cabinets and things. So there are all these modern cases now. But all of those same relics are still there. Okay, I want to make a transition here of these relics leaving churches and going into museums. And clearly, it was not the bones of saints that attracted museums, but the containers in which they were placed. And so I have another picture of this, but this is just a stunning bust of Saint Margaret of Antioch. She's the same woman that was in the dragon's belly and cut herself out with a crucifix she was wearing. And what you see here is a cavity right in her breast where there would have been some relic, some bone or some other thing, and then it would have been covered with a piece of crystal. All right, so these things change context when they go from the church to the museum. They have that's a very interesting thing to ponder, is how do we respond to these relics when we see them in a museum? And also, how do they get from a church to a museum is a question I always ask. And I just want to answer that some of these actually never were in churches. This is a really important reliquary. I'd say this is one of the most important ones in the world for a number of different reasons. This is a reliquary of the Holy Thorn, it's called. And what you see is, it's all made of gold and enamel and precious stones. This is God, and he is holding a thorn. That's the thorn from the crown of thorns. And then at the base of it is what's going to happen at the time of the resurrection. So here are these people pushing open the lids of coffins and jumping out. It's a wonderful thing. It's kind of creepy, but it's a really great thing. The thorn itself comes from the crown of thorns, and that is another of the really interesting relics. It was first brought to France by Louis, King Louis. I think it was Louis IV, who became Saint Louis, and he was at the Crusades, and somebody offered him the crown of thorns, which he believes to be the true relic, and he brings it back to France, and he actually builds a church in Paris that's called Sainte-Chapelle, the crown, that is to hold that relic. And this is the reliquary. It's now at Notre Dame. I actually saw this last year. They don't have it out on display. They have a lot of stuff on display, but this they only bring out for veneration on special days. And it happened that last year I was there during Lent, and they bring it out every Friday in Lent. And again, I got a chance to go up and kiss it, which is really a way to look really closely at the thing if you want to get the closest possible view. But what it has is this crystal tube, which in itself is a really sort of remarkable thing. And it's all entwined with gold and other things. But what you see down here at the bottom is basically a bunch of broken sticks. But from Louis, that thorn, some of those thorns got given to other people. So it was his great-grandson, Jean, the Duke of Berry, that had one of the thorns and had this reliquary made. And then it never was in a church. Excuse me. He passed it along to his heirs. It went to Habsburg heirs, and so traveled around Europe a bit, and then was acquired by the British Museum a few years ago. So it still has the thorn in it, so the relic is still in place and on exhibit in the museum. This just, I will show you Sainte-Chapelle. It's a beautiful church. It has these magnificent, and in fact, did Lafarge do a image of this? I'm trying to remember. This, I think, was where the relic was. As I said, it's now at Notre Dame Cathedral, which is not very far from here. And I actually went to a concert there, which was very nice. But the relic still is in the hands of the church. Here are these relics that left church property and ended up in museums. And the reliquary bust on the left was made by a Dutch carver in the late 15th century. On the right is a silver casket, and it's showing two saints. And if you can see here, one of them, this is the leg being chopped off and the foot sort of flying. So this is actually a foot reliquary. It's not in the shape of a foot, but that's what was in it. I don't think there's anything in it today at the Chicago Art Institute. But this is one example of how relics left their sacred context and went into a secular context. There was a hoard of medieval ecclesiastical art that was originally in Brunswick Cathedral in Braunschweig, Germany. And in the 17th century, a lot of those were removed by the Duke of Brunswick. So he took them and had a private chapel in his castle and brought these relics and had them there. So that the family, during the war, decided to sell them. And what they did was in 1939, they took 85 pieces, and they gave them to some Frankfurt dealers who sold them to a number of different places. So they've ended up at the Cleveland Museum of Art, the Nelson's Atkins Museum in St. Louis, which is an interesting thing that I hadn't really thought about till just this moment, the Chicago Art Institute, and the Bode Museum in Berlin. And so here is at the Chicago Art Institute, and I actually took this picture of things on exhibit. So this is the finger of St. Christina, and there's definitely a finger bone in that piece. So the bone is on exhibit. And this is a 14th century reliquary with a tooth of John the Baptist. And they actually, in one of their brochures, show how they took the relic out at one point from its wrappings and took pictures of it and then stuck it back on top. So there is a tooth in that reliquary. Whether it's John the Baptist or not, I'm not sure. Here's actually he's a favorite. This is a finger of John the Baptist at the Nelson Atkins Museum. And then this magnificent crucifix, enameled crucifix, which is at the Bode Museum in Berlin. And this clearly still has relics in it. The crucifix-shaped ones generally were pieces of the true cross, but oftentimes a reliquary like this might have multiple chambers where you could see relics and would have different kinds of things. And then ordinarily there's some way that you identify them by the pictures that are on the reliquary itself. Back to cathedrals for a minute. There always were great and magnificent works of art in cathedrals as well. And I show you this, Peter Paul Rubens' triptych that's above the main altar in Antwerp Cathedral, the Elevation of the Cross. This is a magnificent thing. It's so magnificent that during the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon stole it from Antwerp Cathedral and brought it back to the Louvre. He also, by the way, stole the 4 horses from the front of San Marco. So they had first been stolen from Constantinople, then stolen from Venice, and when they ended up in Paris, and when Napoleon lost the war, the Duke of Wellington was one of the guys that said, okay, now you got to give this stuff back. Napoleon had stolen everything earlier than the year 1000 from the Vatican Museum. So Laocoon, the Apollo Belvedere, which was at the Vatican, all of those things went to Paris for a time and then were brought back. So there were these great things that were exhibited as works of art, inspirational works of art in museums. But in recent days, museums have begun to take advantage more and more, I think, of the possibility of having an exhibit that in some way explains what they're about. And I just want to talk for a moment about the Abbey Church in Saint-Denis, which is now a Paris suburb, but at one point it was its own little town. And there, Saint Denis, Saint-Denis, was the Bishop of Paris in the 4th century. He was martyred. He was executed by beheading, and after that he stood up, picked up his head, and walked away from the scene. And he walked from Paris to Saint-Denis, and there he set the head down and laid down and admitted he was dead. And so the locals, of course, built a cathedral. And this cathedral was built by the famous abbot Suger, who basically invented Gothic architecture with this particular church. So it's widely noted to be the first Gothic building. During the French Revolution, it also became the place where almost all of the French nobility was entombed. So it was a target during the Revolution, and a lot of the church was destroyed. This is what it looks like today. It still has relics. So there is big reliquary up on the high altar that's said to be relics of Saint Denis. And there's a lot of things about his head and a head reliquary. And in fact, you see it all over Paris. This is the flanking the left door at Notre Dame. That's Saint-Denis holding his head. He was the bishop, so he's always wearing a mitre. And this is actually in Notre Dame. This is said to be the head reliquary of Saint-Denis. I don't know how it got back there from the Saint-Denis church. But this is now in the church at Saint-Denis. They have an exhibit of various kinds of art that are dedicated to Saint-Denis. This is just this. These are not real paintings. I mean, they're reproductions on these gigantic images, but they're really beautifully done. Here is Saint Denis. The blood is still spurting out of his neck, and here are a couple of other guys that were beheaded along with him. They weren't smart enough to pick up their heads and go away, but he was. And they have modern stuff done in wood and in stone, and this is my favorite piece, and that is in the local community today, it's a very diverse ethnic community. It's largely a lot of people from the Caribbean, a lot of Muslims live there. And so this was a local artist who did a little painting of a band. And of course, the saint is the lead singer, and he's holding his head there by the microphone. So, you know, it represents who lives in the neighborhood today. I thought this was a great thing for them to have in that church. And it's in, again, an exhibit that really is, you know, installed to the standards of a museum. So we begin to see this, this incorporation of relics and religious items into museums, but at the same time, museum practices into the churches. And today, churches they're a crucial step in the history of museums, and they continue to be important destinations of pilgrims and tourists in the 21st century. So just to give you some statistics, San Marco in Venice had 6 million visitors in 2015. St. Peter's, 7 million. 4.3 million visitors to the Vatican Museum alone, with and 25,000 people a day at about 16 euros a head. Visitors to Santiago de Compostela, 200,000 people that went as pilgrims and managed to get the documentation for having traveled by foot or bicycle. By foot, 100 kilometers, by bicycle, some greater distance, among 10 million tourists to the city. Cologne Cathedral, which has the relics of the three kings, again, highly doubtful, but an interesting story. The arms of the city of Cologne are 3 crowns and 11 tiers, and it's for the 3 wise men whose relics they say they have, and the 11,000 virgins that followed Saint Ursula and were murdered in Cologne. So these various relics are well represented on their coat of arms. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which was built by Europeans at the place where Joseph of Arimathea is said to have laid the body of Christ. And just to compare that, Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, 3 million visitors. This was a Roman Orthodox church in medieval times. Today it's a mosque, still a very interesting thing. And I think this is interesting too. There's a Travel and Leisure has 43 of the most visited sacred sites. And I think, you know, St. Peter's is the 7th, and San Marco is the 9th or something. But more than half of them are in Asia, and of those, the vast majority are in Japan. So just to, as we think about this, you know, I've presented this almost entirely as a European kind of idea, but in fact, there are other places in the world where people are interested in the things that are in various sacred buildings, and also the pilgrimage. Several years ago, I was in Japan, and there's one island, which I can't remember the name of right now, but there are 88 temples that are around its perimeter, and people do a pilgrimage and walk around to each of the temples. Okay, so that sort of wraps us up here. You know, there's a lot to think about here. I thought these two looked like they're very questioning. I took this at the cloisters, and the one on the left is St. Teresa. You can tell because she has a broken wheel. This is the broken wheel and the sword, and St. Barbara always has a tower, so those are their icons. So we can imagine that the cavities that were here to hold the relics are now empty, but it's a good time to turn to questions. So, yes?
I was intrigued by the existing office that still is maintained to put relics into churches. Provenance is a big issue at museums, but obviously you can't look too carefully at this. Are they actually creating new ones or recycling older ones?
You know, during the papacy of John Paul, they actually added a lot of skeletons of martyrs from Eastern Europe. So that was one of the things that they did. You know, oftentimes the church is actually named after the saint whose relics they have. And so I don't know if you remember a few years ago that the relics of St. Teresa, St. Teresa Lisieux, the little flower from France, who was a doctor of the church, but she was only in her 20s when she died. And she died in a convent, and they have her relics. And did any of you go to the cathedral to see the pageant?
I had the scarf. I had one, this rose-colored pashmina.
Yep.
At a dinner, and I said, oh no, they asked me to pick the ticket, and I said, so I picked the ticket. I picked my own name. And this is at a club, and I said, oh no, put it back, you know. No, they said, you're to have it, and it was this beautiful pashmina, so I wore it, and I named for the little flower, Janice Therese. But anyway, the Knights of Columbus were carrying the relic with me.
Yes.
I was outside, and it was very heavy for them. And hastily, there was an old table at the back of the cathedral. So they brought up the table. It was old, and I pointed to a lady in charge and said, "You want this?" So I put my shawl down so the relic could lay on the shawl.
Oh!
And it was written in the paper by someone the next day, said, and the woman snatched it away. It was just me. I took it. I never snatched it. There were so many people that came to that the priest had to get downstairs and consecrate for.
They passed out rose petals that you could take up and touch to the plexiglass cover of the reliquary. But you created a second-degree relic just by having that sit on top of it. Yes.
I have to, make a.
Yeah.
I still have it. I have to make a note to whom to give it to. Yes, it's a second-degree relic. And I said to my father, your mother, my grandmother, who insisted I be named for her, said she would have loved it.
It was a great pageant. Some of the relics that I have, these ones that are from the 19th and 20th century, there's actually a custom that goes back to the Renaissance where a reliquary so it has the relic in it, and then there is a kind of certification that the Vatican gives it, and that's put in it, and it's sealed with a wax seal. And so that's one of the things to look for. But of course, Maria Goretti, the unfortunate Italian girl who beat off a rapist and was killed in the process, there's her bones are kept and sawed off. And somebody once gave me, actually it was one of my professors at Brown, gave me a reliquary of hers, and then later found a second one that had a little piece of her dress. So those are modern saints. I think, at Vatican II, they actually discussed relics, because one of the things that was happening was bones especially were getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until finally what you were seeing, especially in these reliquaries, are little things that you can barely see it. And they wanted to actually have things that were more recognizable as body parts. So they got back into finger joints and things like that. But they still do have a stockpile of corpses.
I also have a first-class relic of St. Therese, but Sister Sheila, who gave it to me, it was her mother's. But anyway, she told me that sometimes when St. Therese's body was exhumed, they might just put a sheet or linen or something over the body. Yeah. And then they cut all that up as a second.
Right. Anything that touches the body gets to be a second-degree relic.
Right.
Yeah. One more? Yeah.
Does seeing a relic in a museum, to me, that object somehow has lost its sanctity than when it's in a holy place, like a cathedral. Is that?
That's a really interesting question. And, that's not something that only gets asked about, religious relics. When I worked at the Peabody Essex Museum, the Peabody there has a wooden Hawaiian sculpture, Kukailimoku, which there are only 3 of those that survive. They were destroyed in the 19th century by the order of one of the Hawaiian kings who converted to Christianity. And the only 3 that survived had been taken out of there. So 2 of them were actually in the Boston area, and 1 of them was in London. So there's still one there at the British Museum. One of the Boston ones was subsequently sent back to Hawaii, and it's at the Bishop Museum. But there were many times that Native Hawaiians came to the Peabody and wanted to put leis of leaves or leave offerings at Kukailimoku, and that has now become a standard thing in museums. There are a lot of sacred objects in museums from cultures beyond Christianity. And so how museums treat those is, I think, one of the important issues that we're dealing with today. There was actually a conference at Harvard several years ago that came out with a book on sort of how to look at sacred objects from other cultures in museum practice, and it's called Stewards of the Sacred, if anybody's interested, the book of conference papers that came out. But that is a very important question. Yeah?
I'm wondering if there's a second talk, which is one of your favorites with sometimes, on the cathedrals themselves. In other words, the advertisements for this talk are amazing and so forth. And, to go to Cologne and see that cathedral and have people walking in and breaking into groups, making pilgrimage and walking into the buildings themselves
They are phenomenal. They are phenomenal. Yeah. I have tried to go to all of the places that the wife of Bath made a pilgrimage to, which Chaucer said she went to: Rome, Bologna, Santiago de Compostela, Cologne, and Jerusalem. And I think I'm not the person to give a lecture on museum architecture, though. On cathedral architecture, but it is a fabulous subject, and these are fabulous places.
Well, let me.
I'm just putting up my contact information in case.
Let me thank
Yeah.
Mary for a most stimulating lecture.
Thank you, Nancy.